Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey to the automotive world. We talk about the latest news, from new makes and models to new technology to all of the must-have options available. Whether you're a fan of the old classics, love the latest models and technology, or have never met a vehicle you didn't want to work on, the GSMC Car Podcast has something for every car enthusiast.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, David Lucy Mabel. Okay, today, folks, we are going to be talking about one of the most special cars from American history. This car, there was a movie made about it. The company, it was sort of a sad story that ended up ending way earlier than it should have, and it had so much modern features and modern technology, things that we see in cars today, way ahead of its time. And if you are privy to the car world and you are privy to what I am talking about and you are catching the drift of these clues that I'm giving, you would know that I am talking about the beloved Tucker 48, otherwise nicknamed the Tucker Torpedo, like it was originally supposed to be named. The Tucker Torpedo was one of the greatest American cars of all time. I mean, even though 51 were made and about 47 still remain today, the Tucker Torpedo is a car that history has not forgotten and refuses to forget. So today we are going to be talking about the history of the Tucker Torpedo, what you ought to know about it. We are going to be talking about some of the amazing features, including safety tech, that was implemented into the design of this car from a very early stage, from a very early time in automotive history, just back in the late 40s. And we are going to be talking about the failures, why the company failed, what were some problems that the car had from the beginning. And last but not least, you will obviously hear my thoughts in the last segment concerning the Tucker 48 and why I believe that this is a car that is worth learning about, why this is a car that the memory of which is worth preserving. So let's get started. For starters, hence the name, the Tucker 48 was manufactured in 1948. All 51 of them. I believe the prototype, however, was built in 1947. The company went under just a year later in 1949. It was sort of odd because in the early days of automotive manufacturing, especially in the United States, several car companies started and went, came and went, started and ended, started and failed, and a lot of people don't remember them. I mean, like, nobody remembers cars like the Stanley Steamer. Nobody remembers some obscure cars like Franklin's. Nobody remembers obscure cars like ABC or Detroit Motor Company. I mean, nobody remembers things like that. But for some reason, everybody remembers Tucker. This car company was around for literally less than 3 years, and everybody who is in the car world, who has an appreciation for old, quirky, orphan cars, if you will, has an appreciation for the Tucker 48 or the Tucker Torpedo. It's really odd, but as you listen more in the podcast, you will end up finding out why people seem to have a love affair with this car. What made this car so special, and why is it one of the most legendary cars America has ever seen, literally making the list of the top 25 sedans like the best American sedans of all time. The Tucker 48 was on the list. The lowly Tucker 48 that literally made, come from a company that made less than 100 cars, less than 60 cars, and it is on the list. So in order for it to be on that list, in order for it to even be remembered or even considered, that means it had to leave a considerable impact on the car community, and you will soon find out. The Tucker Torpedo was the brainchild of Preston Tucker. Preston Tucker was a man who had a dream for the automobile, and he was not going to stop at anything to make that dream realized. His car that he had designed, that he had developed, was very advanced for the time period. And really, as far as safety features, as far as their ideas, nonetheless, we're on par with, some of, the things that we find standard today in cars. You'll find out more about his safety features, but you will soon know that, provided that this company could make a reliable car, and provided that they weren't dealt such a rough hand, those were probably the safest cars on the road at the time, simply of how they were engineered, how they were built, with what they were built, and with what they kept in mind when they were making this a new car. So not only was it the brainchild of Preston Tucker, it was produced in Chicago, Illinois, at a time in which most cars were produced in Detroit, and the companies were headed up in Detroit, aka Motor City, and it was designed from the get-go with safety in mind. It was, what it reminds me of, especially when I was doing the research on this car, it almost reminds me of Volvo before Volvo became popular. They were the quirky, really safe car company that put safety first above all else, then design was second. Obviously, it's not Volvo, because Volvo's still around. Volvo makes expensive luxury cars that are still super safe and still super quirky, and they're wonderful. But, I feel like if Tucker were to survive to this day still making cars, I feel like his cars would almost have the same sort of vibe as a Volvo. Super quirky, kind of more on the expensive side, but really safe and a really good quality car all around if they could have just, gotten themselves together. Development started during World War II. Now, there is one thing that we should know about World War II in car production. When World War II broke out in 1939 and the U.S. got involved in 1941 after the attack of Pearl Harbor, from 1941 to 1945, there were no cars made in America. There was no car manufacturing. All the car manufacturing plants had been converted either into factories that made Jeeps and other military vehicles, or factories that made supplies to send to the troops in Europe and in Asia. So the fact that Preston Tucker started to design an automobile during World War II was very forward thinking in his mind. It was always easier for small boutique companies to come out with a product, to market a product, to go to sell a product, than it were for the large companies, especially like the big three, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, for them to just willy-nilly come up with a project and then put it into production. You would have to, you would have to jump through a lot of hoops if you were going to do it with a big company. So the fact that Preston Tucker knew that his company was small and he didn't have to jump through a bunch of hoops to get a design approved and for them to start designing it, for them to start building it, and for them to start selling it, he was a very smart man. He knew exactly when to start. So, yeah, you all know that during World War II, production was ceased. From the beginning, however, Tucker was doomed. You see, he didn't have the business sense he needed to go on. He was very much of an engineer. He thought out the car. He designed it. He engineered it so that it would be safe as possible, to the point where this was the epitome of safety in those days. And people would look generations after the Tucker torpedo was killed and over, and the company had gone over. People generations from then looked back and, I guess not stole his ideas, but they took inspiration from his ideas. They modified his ideas to put into their cars because they realized how important it was for him to keep his children safe in automobiles, because automobiles at the time were death traps. So he was looking for an automobile that he could market to the family, that could keep children safe, and that could just keep passengers safe in general. On top of all that, you got really dealt a rough hand. The Tucker torpedo, the Tucker, car company, if I could put it that way, was never given a fair chance to start out in the first place. Bad press and business scandals, as well as the big three, were also rumored in having a hand in Tucker's demise. And the thing is, that makes me upset. It makes me upset because I understand that, cars are a business. Anybody who's listening to this podcast understands that car companies are in it for the money at the end of the day. You're in it for the profit. But it almost seems, I don't know, it almost seems irresponsible for the large car companies of the day to have a hand, or at least rumored to be having a hand. Of course, only history knows. We will never truly know. But to be rumored to be part of the scheme to get Tucker to fail and to be part of his demise. And the reason why that bothers me is that they weren't making anything to replace the Tucker torpedo. They weren't making anything that could even compare to it. If you made something comparable to it and you were marketing and you were having a competition just like a market should have competition, that's a completely different story. But if you are going to try to get rid of someone's brainchild, something as revolutionary in the car world and something as futuristic in the car world as the Tucker torpedo, at least have the decency to make something that would take its place, or have the decency to buy the man out instead of being part of a scheme to force him into bankruptcy so he would lose his house and he would lose his company, blah, 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 all of this foolishness. I mean, just dealing the absolute roughest hand to him as possible. I don't believe that it should have been done that way. Nonetheless, that's what it was done. But the Tucker torpedo, I believe, despite only being produced for 1 year and having, not really a place in the car market, it really has held its own as far as its legacy goes. And of course, later on in the podcast, you're going to learn more about the legacy of the Tucker torpedo and how much these cars are worth today and all sorts of other things that went into developing these cars. It just, this car strikes me as something that paid attention to detail. You can tell Preston Tucker, I don't know the man. I don't even know his biography. All I know is the car that he designed. But you can tell that in the car that he designed, he thought about almost everything. He thought about things that people should not have thought about in car crashes. I mean, just to give you, a little tidbit, the car didn't have a glove box because if the car were to get into a front end collision and the people would fly out of their seats, they would hit the padded dashboard and then be curled up underneath the dashboard where the glove box would have gone in order to create a safe sort of space until the car could be driven again, or if you were in a car accident until you can become rescued and whatnot. I mean, these cars, this man was ahead of his time in his thinking. The cars of this time, they were busy with the affairs of beginning to pound on chrome and to make them faster and to make them as extravagant as possible without going poor. I mean, this was a fundamentally different automobile compared to automobiles of the time. I mean, in the 40s, you had your Cadillacs. Cadillacs have always been excessive. You had your Lincolns. Lincolns were also as excessive. I mean, you had your regular run-of-the-day automobiles that didn't give a flying flop about safety. And then you had Tucker. And it was... I know I've said this, but it was a genuine tragedy in the car community. To see a car like this not catch on. To see a car like this have to wait several decades. We're talking about 6, 7 decades here before it was finally realized in retrospect how great this car actually was and how much it meant to the American automotive scene. So please stay tuned for the next podcast. I am going to be discussing some more things about the Tucker. Specifically, I am going to be discussing basically what were the safety features, what were the other sorts of cool features that this car had, and what are the things that this car had that would make us mind blown for a car that was made 70-something years ago. And not only that, please stay tuned because I'm going to give you my personal thoughts on the Tucker Torpedo. And, I'm going to basically reminisce with the car history, the car gods, if you will, reminisce on the time that, the Tucker was a thing that looked rather promising until it was dealt a bad hand. So please stay tuned after the break, and I will join you in the next segment.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Okay, welcome back, wonderful car people. Right now, as you know, we are still talking about the 1948 Tucker Torpedo, or otherwise known as the Tucker 48. And we are going to be talking about some of the safety features that this car had. In the last segment, you basically got a brief history on the history of the Tucker Torpedo, the car company that was once known as Tucker, and some of the things that Preston Tucker really had in mind when he was designing this car, when he was making it, and when he was going to market it to the public. So let's just dig a little deeper into the things that this car was meant to offer, and some of the features that didn't make it into production because, the car was already doomed from the beginning, and so production wasn't as smooth as it should have been. But other than that, let's get started. Preston Tucker, let's just say, had all sorts of wonderful ideas for the 48. One of the most prominent features on this car is the fact that it has 3 headlights. It has one on the left, one on the right, and one in the center. Now, what does the center do? The center headlight is actually a headlight that is attached to the steering mechanism of the car. So whenever you would steer the car, it would also turn the headlights so that you would be able to see where you are going around the corner. Now, this is the first American production car to use this feature. Not to say that cars back then their headlights hadn't swiveled with the turning of the wheels of the car. That doesn't mean that it wasn't from the Tucker. I mean, this is something that we still see today, and it was pioneered by the Tucker 48. This was the first American car to introduce such a feature. So let's talk about some of the other things. They had a perimeter frame for crash protection. This is something that is commonly seen on later body-on-frame construction cars. For example, your Lincoln Town car, body-on-frame construction, rear-wheel drive, that whole deal. I mean, they have perimeter frames to keep you safe in crashes. But we're talking about the time where the Tucker torpedo came out. This was revolutionary. Cars back then, in the 40s and the 50s, in those times especially, were bona fide death traps. You get a side hit on that car, there were no airbags back then. So, you would have to rely on crumple zones if there are no airbags. There were no crumple zones. If you relied on crumple zones, you would have to rely on the fact that, there would be enough metal between you. A lot of times, these doors of these time period were real thin skinned, had a couple of things in them just to roll up your window, maybe a couple of gears and whatnot, and that was it. Tucker wasn't like that. I mean, he designed the car with a perimeter frame so that the occupants would be safe in the event of a crash. This was not something that was given into much consideration at the time. I almost feel, looking back on that time period, the reason why cars weren't made safe, maybe it's not even because people didn't know how to put safety in cars. I feel like it was almost, oh my goodness, it was almost as if though they just didn't care. It was almost as if though they didn't care. Oh, well, what are the odds if you're going to actually get into a crash? We don't have to put something, to protect you. Just be careful when you're driving. You'll be fine. I mean, yeah, you might be fine, but how much better would you be if you knew that you had a car that had safety features that you could take advantage of to keep yourself safe and to keep your wife safe, to keep your children safe, to keep your family safe, essentially. I mean, it's a no-brainer to me. Not only did it have a perimeter frame, the roll bar was integrated into the roof. I'm going to let you all in on a tidbit of information. My car, which is a 2004 Buick Park Avenue, does not have a roll cage integrated into the roof. I mean, this was crazy. And especially when you think of it, it's not like people were going to take your Tucker torpedo off-roading, or it's not like the car was, in danger of flipping over, that you would ever land on your roof. But they put that into consideration. They had a roll cage designed and implemented into the final stages and into the final design of the car that was being produced. I mean, it was amazing. It was simply amazing, the attention to detail that Preston Tucker had when he basically birthed this car from his brain, this brilliant idea. And this was one of the other brilliant ideas. Not only that, the windshield was made of shatterproof glass. Now, today, all cars are fitted with safety glass, all new cars in 2020. And most cars, frankly, in the modern era are produced with, were produced with safety glass. But in those days, that's not what it was. That's not what it was. It was regular old glass that they put in cars. This car used shatterproof glass. Where did he get his hands on shatterproof glass? Where did he source it? It doesn't matter. It was probably terribly expensive, but the fact that he was able to source it and put it in the fact that this car was able to have this feature is an amazing feat. It really is. Let's move on. We are going to talk about the fact that the windshield not only was made of shatterproof glass, it was made to pop out in the event of a collision. This is an idea that they have in school buses now. I remember as a young child that when we were practicing bus safety with the bus driver towards the beginning of every school year, they would always tell us that if anything ever happened to the bus and that you couldn't get out of the door and you couldn't get out in one of the sliding windows, your best bet was to kick the windshield out because it would pop out and that you would be able to be rescued. I mean, this is something that could have saved a lot of lives if Tucker was given a chance. If Tucker was given a chance to make his automobile shine, to make his automobile known, to produce more automobiles if he was given a chance. And unfortunately, he wasn't. It wasn't in the odds of the car gods, if I could put it that way. It wasn't in their will for this to happen. So even though they had all these revolutionary safety features, the Tucker torpedo was just never given a chance, despite the fact that everybody knew that these were safe cars. They were just never given a chance. Moving on, you had the padded dashboard. I already spoke about the padded dashboard towards the end of the last segment, but if I may reiterate, is the fact that the padded dashboard was much more than a dashboard with foam on it to keep you from hitting a hard piece of metal if you flew forward in your seat. The padded dashboard also included the fact that it had the glove box removed and that little chamber in like the passenger side footwell underneath the dashboard in cars. This was known as there was a term for it, I can't remember. It was like a crash cubby, if I could rename it or something. It was a crash chamber. That's what it was. I remembered it. The crash chamber is, if you were to fly forward, you would hit the padded dash, and then your body would end up being nestled under the dashboard of the car, so you would be protected from any impact that would come that would end up injuring you if you had stayed in your seat. That's an amazing thing. I mean, of course, nowadays we have crumple zones. We have other things to worry about. We don't have to worry about that. But think of it this way. Not only do you not have to worry about all of that, it's peace of mind. Knowing that if you could fly forward in your seat in the event of a crash, you would hit the padded dashboard, you would land on the ground, and the car would protect you, especially because you're in that little crash chamber. Perimeter, side rails, and everything would all protect you because you're in that little crash chamber that has been made extremely safe. It's like the predecessor to crumple zone technology. But once again, people didn't give this car a chance. They didn't give it a chance. And you will hear me gripe, moan, and complain about that throughout the entire podcast. Preston Tucker should have been given a chance to continue to produce his cars. And I feel like the roads would have been a safer place today if it were allowed to continue. The roads would be a lot safer if Tucker was allowed to continue experimenting with safety features and adding them to his cars as he continued to produce them and pass it down to someone else. Let's talk about not only the fact that there was a padded dashboard, there were seatbelts too. This was a crazy thing because I don't believe seatbelts were mandated until, I believe, the late 60s, but I'm thinking it's early to mid 70s actually that seatbelts were mandated. He had them before they even started talking about seatbelts. Before anybody started talking about seatbelts, he had come out with it and basically used them to demonstrate how safe his car would be. The fact that you would go in and you would strap yourself into your seat instead of just sliding around on the bench seat that so many other cars were capable of doing back in those days. I mean, it's a stark contrast. Absolutely stark contrast. But I'm very thankful. I'm very thankful that the Tucker 48 had these features, because these are sorts of features that would end up trickling down into cars that we drive today. And who knows, if he had not pioneered these things, maybe they would have never become popular. There's not really a way to tell. Just before the time in this segment runs out a little bit, let's talk about the other innovations. The rear engine and rear wheel drive setup. This is the first American car to have a rear-mounted engine, rear-wheel drive setup. And that's not that crazy, but it was the first car. Now, what makes it crazy is the fact that this rear engine and this transmission that we speak of were mounted on a separate subframe from the rest of the car and was attached only using 6 bolts. Preston Tucker was thinking so ahead of his time, he envisioned that different engines could be swapped into the car, and that you can purchase several engines for your car, and you can just swap them after you drop the subframe, put the new one in while the other one was getting worked on if need be. And you would still have a viable car. You would just put your temporary engine in it, because it was only supposed to take about 30 minutes in his own logic anyway for you to remove the engine and the transmission with the 6 bolts from the separate subframe, put a new one in, put some fluid, and call it a day. I mean, this is an amazing thing. These are sorts of things that, you see at racetracks where they pull into the pit, and then within 10 seconds, I mean, they already got a brand new set of tires. I mean, that's what what's his name? Oh goodness, I'm sorry, I forgot. But that's his name, Preston Tucker, that was his idea. That engines would be able to swap, and you would have several engines while one is getting worked on. You just slap another one in your car and you go along your way, because it was only supposed to take a couple of minutes anyway, because he made it so easily mounted and so easily dismounted, if I could put it that way. And not only that, engine and transmission were easy to remove, but there were some other innovations that didn't make it into final production. Magnesium wheels. The magnesium wheels were supposed to be super lightweight. You know what happens when you have lightweight wheels? It reduces unsprung weight in your car. There were supposed to be disc brakes, front and rear. Disc brakes didn't become completely common probably until the 70s, 80s. I mean, we're talking about 30, 40 years after this car's time. And it was supposed to have self-sealing tires that you didn't even need a spare for. Once they were punctured, I guess some sort of chemical or whatnot would be added to the tires so that they would self-seal upon being punctured. I don't know exactly how self-sealing tires work, but nonetheless, that is a great idea. Engine was supposed to be a flat 6. As you will end up figuring out, the engine that they wanted to use was not the engine that they ended up putting into the production car. There were some complications with that. And not only that, many of these features, like I said earlier, live on in production cars of today. So, now that you know some of the safety features about the Tucker 48, you should really stay tuned for the next segment, in which I'm going to be talking about why the car failed. I mean, you all have made it this far into the podcast. You've heard about this wonderful automobile that I'm completely romanticizing, but just like any other modern person, they don't make these cars anymore. So what exactly happened? And I will tell you what exactly happened in the next segment. So please stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching.
Hey!
The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Okay, welcome back, wonderful car people. So now we have reached segment 3 in this podcast about the Tucker 48. We are going to be talking about the failures. And this is actually going to be mainly discussing some of the failures that were realized in the car as soon as it was unveiled. You see, the day that this car was to be unveiled to the public was a day from Hades. I'm not going to say the other word, but it's the opposite of heaven. This was a bad day. Pretty much anything that could go wrong really did go wrong with the prototype of this car. And we're talking about, this is an auto show, news is there, press is there, journalists, they're interviewing, they're watching, they're, compiling information so they can go tell the world about what they saw at the new automotive show. And this just behemoth of a car rolls out onto the stage, and it's super heavy, and it's nothing like the people had ever seen before. And it's a Tucker torpedo. It was extremely heavy. It was an extremely heavy prototype that was used at the premiere. It broke the front suspension arms. Literally, upon moving onto the stage and moving under its own weight, the car was so heavy and ungainly that it ended up breaking under its own weight, essentially. It broke the suspension of the car. Not only that, the engine was super loud. It was actually rumored that the orchestra was told to play very loud in order to drown out the sound of the engine that it was making. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing. All of these things, aside from other factors, this was probably one of the things, the fact that he probably didn't get a good review about his car at this auto show that ended up killing the car in the long run. So not only did they have weak front suspension arms that couldn't handle the weight of the car, engine was very loud. Thankfully, the orchestra was able to play to drown out the sound of said noisy engine from a car. The newspaper columnist reported the prototype couldn't go backwards, and that it seemed to go goose geese down the road, earning the nickname the Tin Goose. Now, this is rather sad. I'm going to say it's rather sad because the journalists didn't do this man fair. This car is a prototype. Obviously, it's not a fully functioning model. But what Tucker should have done? Tucker should have really made sure the car was refined, even if it had to wait a couple of years before going to the auto show. He should have made sure the car was refined so that it went there and that it was actually able to perform. It was actually able to act like a car instead of getting up there with a broken suspension and sitting there basically as a giant dead weight. So yeah, it didn't go well. And the innovative engine never made it in to the production car. The innovative engine was a flat 6-cylinder car with hemispherical heads, and it was supposed to make like 150 to 200 horsepower. Upon coming back home, upon seeing how unrealistic it was for all that to be done, the engine that they wanted just didn't work out. It just didn't work out. They ended up putting another engine in there that was much slower, that only made about 80-something horsepower. And that was basically, them cheaping out. They couldn't actually put the engine that they wanted to put in there because they would have had to call up people who could develop those things. They would have had to do a lot of things that they simply couldn't do in order for them to, get this car roadworthy and everything. He really should have made sure that it was ready to go across the block at not the auction, but, the debut of the car to the world. It was, they settled with less power. Nowadays they are super collectible. And by they, I obviously mean the Tucker 48. They're super collectible and sought after by car collectors. This is where I want to get with you all. The fact that this car was so amazing, the fact that the car was so ahead of its time, the fact that this car has garnered such a huge cult following is not because the car was any good. It was horrible. But it was the idea. It was the idea that produced such a car that people fell in love with. It wasn't the design of the car. I mean, the design of the car was hardly offensive by the standards of the day. It wasn't classically beautiful, but it wasn't ugly either. But at that time, you're World War II, about to get out, it's about to be the end of the war, you're going to unveil your new car, blah, blah, blah. I mean, this was a time that it just didn't work. It didn't work for the Tucker. It didn't work. But the fact that it didn't work made people, in retrospect, love it so much. It's almost as if though it's a root for the underdog sort of thing. These are cars that have been through a lot. This is a car company that had been through a lot. They're cultural references. About the Tucker torpedo in movies and whatnot. This is a car that's been through a lot. It's a car that's been through a lot, and this is what makes it so beloved amongst people nowadays. I was literally so excited last year on my road trip when I went to the Tallahassee Automobile Museum. Not only did I see the car from the movie, the replica that was destroyed in the movie, I saw the actual car itself, a green 1948 Tucker 48. It was absolutely beautiful. I touched it. Too bad the doors were locked. I couldn't open it up and sit inside of it. But this was an amazing car just to stand within feet of it, because it was the rarest car in the entire museum, if not one of the rarest cars in the entire museum. And the fact that they're beloved. They are beloved. People love these cars despite the fact that they were absolutely horrible when they came out. But it was the idea. Not so much the execution. It was the idea that made people fall in love with these cars. Not only are they super sought after, a good original working running model could probably fetch upwards of $1 million at auction. There are not many cars that are that old that would sell for $1 million. There are not many cars in general that would sell for $1 million. But this, my friends, is a Tucker torpedo. One of 51 made, 47 surviving to this day. I mean, this is not a car you take lightly. This is a big deal. This is a big deal. No matter how terrible it was still a big deal. Most of them, that being said, are in museums, including one in Japan. I went to Japan last year, and if it wasn't so far away, I would have gone to go see the Tucker 48 that they had in a museum, but it was clear on the other side of the country. It was going to take like a 6-hour train ride. I wasn't about that, but it was amazing. It was amazing getting to see it at the Tallahassee Automobile Museum. There's something that is romantic about the Tucker 48. There's something romantic about cars that, how do I put it? It's something romantic about the orphan cars. The cars that had a great idea, but the car was never executed properly. They didn't do it justice. And, you know, now in retrospect, now that the car is old, the company that manufactures the car is defunct. Now it's like the legacy of the car is finally doing it justice, the justice it deserves. The Tucker 48 reminds me a lot of the DMC DeLorean, a car company that was very new, an upstart, not really good at making cars because they don't know anything, but willing to learn. I mean, this was amazing. This was amazing. The Tucker 48 was an amazing car. I mean, you can't go wrong about that. You can't go wrong about that. The fact that this car was just like the DMC DeLorean, just like I had just mentioned, coming from a car company that wasn't good at making cars but was willing to learn and garnered a cult following as a result. Yeah. Tucker 48 was a great car. And you know, what matters was the fact that Preston Tucker tried. He would have never made a name for himself. History would have forgotten him. He would have just been seen as one of those other automotive hopefuls who threw the dice and gambled in the car game, and the dice didn't return anything profitable, so they pulled out. But I would say if this man knew how much the car community loves him and how much they revere him for the fact that he was able to design a noble, proper, safe automobile for the 1940s, I mean, he would rejoice if he was able to see that despite his car was a failure, despite the fact that his car was a failure in the time that it was being produced, doesn't mean that it would never come to function again. Just because you know it wasn't loved doesn't mean it wouldn't be loved by today's people. So I believe Preston Tucker would be very proud. And you know, the thing is, just like I said earlier, the fact that he tried made up for any sort of problem that the car would have had, any sort of anything that the car would have had, because he tried, and he tried his best. And that in itself is worth a round of applause. So please stay tuned for the next segment. Wow, it's already time for the next segment. The time has flown by with this podcast because I genuinely love this car so much. You know, you just have fun talking about things that you love so much. But please stay tuned. You will hear more of my personal thoughts, and you will hear basically what I think, you know, the Tucker 48 represents to me as a car lover and as someone who appreciates vintage cars, especially the quirky ones that nobody really knows and nobody really talks about. So please stay tuned after the break for the last and final segment. Thank you.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
Okay, welcome back, car people. I can actually talk now. It's the last segment, but let me allow you to have a recap of what was discussed. So far in the podcast, we discussed, obviously, the history, some of the things that you want to know about the Tucker 48. We discussed the safety features that made this car so wonderful, and we discussed basically the legacy that this car has left behind and the reason why it was a failure. Like I said, I have always loved the Tucker 48. I have a love for those historical cars from people who had great visions, maybe, but who just couldn't execute them properly. I've always loved the cars that were revolutionary, ahead of their time, that really set the tone for a generation of car designers later on to come after them and to make sure that these cars, even if they didn't survive, that the ideas that they helped pioneer survive. For example, the Tucker 48 had seatbelts. This is something that eventually would come and people would realize how safe it was to have seatbelts. People would begin to wear them. The Tucker 48 had a padded dashboard. People in due time who used to make their dashboards out of metal, and it was color coordinated to the rest of the car. I mean, in some really pretty cars, but this is something, the padded dashboard, I mean, this is something that made its way into other cars. Cars these days have padded dashboards in order to lessen the impact if you were to go flying into it after a car accident. I mean, there are so many things that the Tucker 48 came out with that make me personally so happy. So as you can tell, I as much as I praise this car, I really do love it. I love the idea that it stands behind. I love the fact that it was made for safety above all else, especially in a time where cars were notoriously unsafe. Cars were basket cases. I mean, you didn't want to drive a car for a long time because, they just weren't reliable and they weren't safe. They weren't safe. So the fact that he was, he had it within him to make a safe car is a very noble thing, in my book. I've long looked up to this car. I've long looked up to its car. As Doug DeMuro would say, it is a gold mine of quirks and features. If I just wish that I could see Doug DeMuro review a 1948 Tucker Torpedo. Maybe if he got his hands on a clean one that was owned by a private person that would let him drive it. I mean, maybe he might do it one day. But I feel like this car is definitely worth the hype. It's definitely worth the excitement that people give it, because this is a wonderful automobile. Tucker marched to the beat of his own drum. And I guess that's really what I was trying to explain in the last segment. Tucker really marched to the beat of his own drum in the fact that everything that he did, to get this car company started. I mean, he thought he was going to take on the big three. He didn't. They took him on instead and then ended up forcing him out of business. But the fact that he was even so confident to do something like that, it reflected in his car. It reflected in his car. It reflected in the fact that the car was unlike any other car from the time period. It didn't look like other cars. It didn't function like other cars. It wasn't a death trap like other cars. It wasn't there for just show with a bunch of showy chrome and there to offer no function. It was there for a purpose. It was there to lead the way in safety technology for cars of the future. And that's exactly what the Tucker 48 did. It was as if though it was a concept car to show all the other car companies out there, look, this is the future. This is the future. Follow my lead. It was almost as if though it was a concept car that was put into production for people of the road. A concept car in the truest sense, just there to showcase an idea. The Tucker 48, I've never driven one, obviously, but I strike that it's not going to be someone's daily driver, especially how rare it is. But it strikes me that this is showing the other car manufacturers the way, or at least it was showing them the way. And not only did Tucker march to the beat of his own drum, he was not afraid to take risks. I mean, one of the greatest risks was the fact that the third headlight was illegal in like 14 states. And then they end up having to manufacture a cover for it so that, those cars could be legally sold in those states. That was just a small setback. That didn't turn him down. That didn't, deter him. I mean, there were a couple of, small things that came his way that were setbacks, but he wasn't deterred. He was determined to see his project through. And eventually, they got to him. But the thing is, I have a suspicion that Tucker did not go without a fight. Tucker did not go without a fight. He did not close his doors without a fight. I mean, just think of it. One could never hope to do something like this today. Just willy-nilly start your own car company and pave the future for American automobiles by starting your own car company. Even if you weren't the one producing the automobiles for the entire company or the entire country. The fact that you are producing automobiles, you've got a market share. I mean, you've got a percentage of the market out there. You've got a percentage of people who are listening to you, who are proud of you, who want to see you achieve. I mean, it was amazing. Unfortunately, he didn't have that, but I feel like if the circumstances were right and if they basically didn't snipe his company, I feel like he would have been up there. Maybe he would have been the big four. Maybe it would have been Chrysler, GM, and Ford along with Tucker. Maybe it would have been the big four American car companies. Maybe they would have merged. Maybe they would have done something. But it's too late to tell now. The fact in the matter is the Tucker Torpedo was an amazing automobile. It was an amazing automobile way ahead of its time. Way ahead of so many things. Way ahead of everything. I mean, the Tucker Torpedo is a car that will always have a special spot in my heart. Ever since I learned about it, ever since I saw, what went wrong and what could have been fixed. If, I guess, Tucker just had better business sense and had someone that was giving him advice on what to do with the car. If he didn't just rush into production that way in an attempt to take on the big three, maybe the car would have still been produced, albeit in a limited fashion, or maybe the Tucker would have sold for 30 years instead of just, 1 year. We will never truly know. We will never truly know. But all I can say is that of all the cars that history has orphaned, of all the cars that history has forgotten, I think it is the biggest crime to forget about the Tucker 48. An amazing automobile. An amazing automobile, not just by standards of the day, but standards of today. An amazing automobile in the sense that a lot of care was put into developing it, care for the safety of the customer, care for the safety of their children if they had any and they were going to be riding in these cars, safety for people who will take this, to heart, who wanted to buy a car that was safe for their family. It was amazing. It was amazing. Not just the story of the Tucker, not the car itself, the people behind it, the entire, short-lived 48 built existence that the Tucker went through. It is a blessing to me personally that people still even talk about this car. And really what actually prompted me to write a podcast on the Tucker 48. And I feel like the podcast can't even do it justice, frankly. But I feel like what really prompted me was the fact that I saw a tweet the other day. And if you follow us on Twitter, you will see this tweet. I retweeted someone spotting a Tucker 48 on the interstate. Obviously privately owned, that the person loved their Tucker so much that they were taking it out for a spin on the interstate. And, you know, it just makes me happy. It makes me happy that people preserve these old cars, that they make them new again, they drive them like they were new. I mean, that's amazing. That is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful thing. And I am not going to, you know, shy away from the fact that, you know, not every concept car, not every car, not everything that you see can be a Tucker 48. I mean, and not every car can be, you know, not every car can be a John D. Rockefeller either. I mean, of the car world. You know, some cars are meant for one thing, some cars are meant for another. And I believe that this car, with its story, with its roots, with its everything, is wonderful. It's wonderful. They paid attention to what the people wanted. They paid attention to what the people wanted, and they delivered. At least, maybe not what they wanted, but what they thought they needed, what the people actually needed. And it wasn't until several years later that, you know, I mean, it wasn't until several years later that people realized how wonderful the Tucker Torpedo was, the Tucker 48 was. So thank you so much for listening to this podcast. Thank you so much for going down automotive memory lane with me down to the days of the Tucker 48, the days of Preston Tucker. What were some of the things that he had to deal with when manufacturing this car? What were some of the things that he had to deal with receiving negative backlash from the people that he had basically worked so hard with to make the car? How did he survive all of this? So thank you so much for participating in this with me. It does me well to know that people are going to be out there, they're going to listen to this, and they are going to make good of their knowledge of the Tucker. They're going to make good of their history, and they're going to put it to good use. So please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, leave us a like on Facebook, like our YouTube videos, do anything, subscribe. All of that really does help us. And thank you and have a good night. Oh, and before I leave, of course, this is the GSMC Car Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Car Podcast Network. Have a good night, folks, and thank you for listening.
You've been listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's episode.